Michael Hart gripped the controls as his spacecraft bucked violently, alarms blaring in the tight cockpit. He'd been caught in the gravity well of an uncharted planet, the ship's systems overwhelmed by the sudden turbulence. The planet loomed large through the cockpit window, a vibrant swirl of colors, a world teeming with life but completely unknown. "Mayday, mayday." Michael's voice crackled into the comms, but deep down, he knew it was pointless. There was no one out there to hear him. His mission had taken him too far from any established trade routes or colonies. He was alone. As the atmosphere burned around his ship, the hull groaned and panels sparked in protest. Michael's heart pounded in his chest, but his focus was sharp. Years of training as an exploration pilot honed his instincts. His mind raced through procedures as he manually fired stabilizers and redirected power to shields, trying to slow his descent. "Hold together," he muttered, eyes darting over the flickering instruments. "Just a little longer." But the planet wasn't making it easy. Violent winds buffeted the ship as it plummeted through thick clouds, the landscape below quickly coming into view, a dense jungle of towering trees and glowing flora. With a final desperate jerk of the controls, Michael angled the ship toward a relatively flat stretch of land. The impact was brutal. The ship skidded across the jungle floor, plowing through alien vegetation before finally coming to a grinding halt. Metal groaned and hissed as the ship settled, smoke rising from the wreckage. For a moment, everything was still. Michael blinked, disoriented but alive. His ears rang, his hands still gripping the controls with white-knuckled intensity. Slowly, he unstrapped himself and forced the cockpit door open. The air was humid, thick with the scent of unknown flora, and strangely, it was breathable. He stumbled out, taking in the surreal landscape. Enormous trees stretched toward the sky, their bark glowing softly in hues of green and blue. Strange, luminous insects flitted through the air, casting a faint glow in the darkening twilight. It was beautiful and completely alien. Michael wiped the sweat from his brow and surveyed the wreckage. The ship was damaged beyond repair. He was stranded. As the reality of his situation sank in, Michael knew he had to act quickly. He needed to secure shelter, food, and water, and figure out how to send a distress signal that someone might eventually pick up. Moving with a soldier's discipline, he scavenged what he could from the wreckage: supplies, tools, and a handheld scanner. The jungle buzzed with strange sounds as he made his way toward a nearby clearing, the thick underbrush crunching beneath his boots. But as he moved, something made him stop. An instinctive sense that he was not alone. The rustling in the foliage ahead was too rhythmic, too deliberate to be mere wind. Michael's hand went to his sidearm as he crouched, eyes scanning the thick vegetation. The alien flora glowed softly, casting faint shadows across the clearing. His heart raced, muscles tensed. Then he saw her. Emerging from the jungle's edge was a figure unlike any creature he had expected to find. A woman, tall and striking, her skin shimmering faintly in the low light. Her hair flowed like liquid silver, and her eyes, large and luminous, locked onto his with an intensity that made him freeze. She was undeniably alien. Her skin was pale with a subtle iridescence that caught the fading light, and her clothing, woven from some natural material, clung to her athletic frame, blending with the surrounding jungle. She moved with a grace that seemed almost feline, her gaze never wavering from his. Michael's hand tightened around his weapon, but he didn't draw it. Something in her posture, in the calmness of her approach, told him she wasn't a threat, at least not immediately. They stood there, staring at each other across the clearing, two strangers from different worlds, neither sure what the other's next move might be. After a tense moment, the woman spoke, her voice a melodic blend of sounds that Michael couldn't understand. The words were foreign, but there was no hostility in her tone. In fact, she seemed as curious about him as he was about her. Slowly, Michael raised his hands, palms up, a gesture of peace. "I don't understand you," he said softly, hoping his tone conveyed his intent. "I'm not here to hurt you." The woman tilted her head slightly, her eyes narrowing as she studied him. Then, with deliberate grace, she mimicked his gesture, raising her own hands, palms open. A gesture of peace. Michael exhaled, relieved. They were making progress. But before he could say anything else, she stepped closer, her gaze flickering toward the wreckage of his ship. Her eyes widened slightly, and she spoke again, her tone more urgent this time. Michael glanced back at the wreckage, wondering if she had recognized the ship, or perhaps knew something about the dangers of this planet that he didn't. But before he could ask, the woman gestured for him to follow her, her movements swift and fluid as she disappeared into the jungle. For a moment, Michael hesitated. He didn't know her, didn't know where she was leading him, but there was something about her, a quiet authority, a confidence that made him trust her, despite the strangeness of their encounter. With one last look at the wrecked ship, Michael made his decision. Slinging his pack over his shoulder, he followed her into the alien jungle, deeper into a world that was as mysterious as the woman who had just entered his life. The jungle seemed alive as Michael followed the alien woman through its dense undergrowth. Strange, bioluminescent plants lit their path, casting eerie shadows on the forest floor. Every now and then, Michael glanced at the woman ahead of him, trying to make sense of her. She moved with a quiet grace, her silver hair shimmering in the soft glow of the surrounding flora. Her skin, pale with a subtle iridescence, almost seemed to blend into the environment, as if she was a natural part of this alien world. He wanted to ask her who she was, where she was leading him, but the language barrier between them was obvious. Every now and then, she glanced back, her expression unreadable, but her eyes held an intensity that made Michael believe she wasn't just a stranger here. There was something regal in the way she carried herself, a quiet authority that commanded respect. After what felt like hours of navigating the winding jungle paths, they emerged into a clearing. In the center was a small, makeshift shelter, constructed from natural materials, fallen branches, leaves, and vines, crafted with a surprising level of sophistication. It was clear this was her home. The woman gestured for Michael to sit near a glowing tree stump that seemed to serve as a hearth, its bioluminescent light casting a soft warmth over the area. She spoke again, this time slower, more deliberate, as if trying to communicate something important. But once again, her language was foreign to him. Frustrated by the gap between them, Michael shook his head slightly. "I wish I could understand you," he said quietly. The woman watched him for a moment, then raised her hand and pointed at herself. "Alara," she said, her voice soft but firm, clearly indicating her name. Michael blinked, surprised that they had finally made a connection, however small. "Alara," he repeated, nodding. Alara gave him a faint smile before gesturing for him to speak. "Michael," he said, placing a hand on his chest. "My name is Michael." She repeated his name, her accent lilting and unfamiliar but somehow beautiful. They had established a basic connection, a small bridge between their worlds. Encouraged, Michael gestured around the clearing and then toward her, hoping she'd understand the question. Alara's expression shifted slightly, her brow furrowing as if considering whether or not to answer. She took a deep breath and began to speak slowly, her hands moving as she tried to convey meaning. Michael watched closely, following her gestures as best he could. From what little he could gather, Alara had once belonged to a great society, one that had fallen. Her expression darkened as she mimed a crown, then used her hands to imitate a violent overthrow. It hit Michael like a punch. She wasn't just anyone. She was royalty, an exiled princess from a world he knew nothing about. Her gestures continued, revealing a tragedy that made his chest tighten. She had been overthrown by someone close to her. Family, perhaps? Her brother? It was difficult to understand everything, but the pain in her eyes was unmistakable. She was a ruler without a kingdom, hiding from those who sought to destroy her. Michael felt a surge of empathy. He had been stranded and alone on this planet for mere hours, and already he felt the crushing weight of isolation. But Alara, she had been living this exile for much longer, surviving on the fringes of her world, evading capture, clinging to some last shred of hope. "I'm so sorry," Michael said softly, though he knew she wouldn't understand the words. He placed a hand on his chest and bowed his head slightly, trying to show his empathy. Alara's eyes softened, and she nodded, as if understanding his sentiment. For a moment, they sat in silence, the glowing hearth casting a soft light between them. Despite the vast differences in their worlds and experiences, they had found common ground, two souls stranded on the same alien planet, both searching for something more. The following days were a blur of survival and adaptation. Michael, with Alara's guidance, began to understand the rhythm of life on this alien planet. The flora and fauna, though strange, were not entirely unfamiliar in the way nature thrived. Alara had been living in this jungle for what must have been years, and her knowledge of the land was vast. She showed Michael how to identify edible plants, how to avoid the dangerous creatures that roamed the forest at night, and how to use the natural resources around them to build and maintain their shelter. In return, Michael shared his skills, tools fashioned from what remained of his ship, methods of fortifying their shelter, and strategies for long-term survival. His background in survival training became invaluable as he constructed simple traps to catch small animals and designed a rainwater collection system to ensure they had a steady supply of clean water. Together, they formed an unlikely team, blending their knowledge and skills. As they worked side by side, the language barrier slowly began to break down. Alara taught Michael key words in her language, while he taught her some of his. Their communication was still rudimentary, but they were learning to understand each other through gestures, expressions, and shared experiences. One evening, as the sky darkened into a stunning array of purples and blues, Michael and Alara sat by their small fire, watching the flickering flames. The bond between them had grown, built on trust, cooperation, and the shared burden of survival. Michael found himself increasingly drawn to her quiet strength, her resilience in the face of exile, and the grace with which she navigated the dangers of her world. He had never met anyone like her. Alara glanced over at him, her silver hair catching the firelight as she gave him a small smile. "Michael," she said, her voice soft but certain, as if she was tasting the shape of his name on her lips. "Friend." The word hung in the air, and Michael felt a warmth spread through him. He smiled back, nodding. "Friend," he repeated, feeling the word take on a new weight. It was more than just friendship. It was a partnership, a connection that transcended language and species. Their lives were far from easy, and the threat of Alara's enemies was never far from their minds. But for the first time since his crash, Michael didn't feel so alone. And as he looked into Alara's eyes, he saw something more than just gratitude. There was a spark there, something unspoken but undeniably real. As they sat in the quiet of the night, surrounded by the alien beauty of the jungle, Michael realized that this exile, this strange twist of fate, had brought him something he had never expected. It had brought him her. Days turned into weeks, and the strange alien world began to feel more like home for Michael. His bond with Alara deepened, and though they still struggled with the language barrier, they had developed a silent communication that spoke more through gestures, expressions, and the small moments they shared. Trust had turned into friendship, and friendship was now evolving into something more intimate, something neither of them had expected, but couldn't deny. One evening, as the twin moons began to rise over the alien jungle, Alara gestured for Michael to follow her. She seemed excited, her usual calm demeanor replaced with a flicker of joy. Michael, intrigued, grabbed his gear and followed her deeper into the forest. They traveled for hours, moving through the dense foliage until they reached the edge of a vast, open plain. The sight that greeted Michael took his breath away. The sky above shimmered with brilliant colors, as if the heavens themselves were alive. Waves of light, blues, purples, greens, and golds, danced across the stars, twisting and shifting in mesmerizing patterns. It reminded him of the northern lights back on Earth, but here the display was far more intense, almost otherworldly. Alara smiled as she saw his awe, her eyes reflecting the vibrant lights. She motioned for him to sit beside her on a soft patch of glowing moss. As they sat together watching the sky's spectacular show, Alara began to speak, her voice soft and reverent. She explained in her halting mix of their two languages that this was the Festival of Lights, a natural phenomenon caused by the planet's magnetic fields interacting with the atmosphere. It was a sacred event for her people, a time when they believed the universe itself revealed its deeper truths, a connection between their world and the cosmos beyond. Michael listened carefully, captivated not just by the beauty of the lights, but by the way Alara spoke about her world. She wasn't just describing a scientific event. This was personal, deeply tied to her culture, her identity as a princess in exile. He realized that while she had been cut off from her people, from her throne, the planet itself had remained her one constant. The Festival of Lights was a reminder of what she had lost, and what she still hoped to reclaim. As the colors above swirled in brilliant hues, Michael found his gaze drawn more to Alara than to the sky. Her face, illuminated by the soft glow of the lights, was filled with quiet wonder. She looked almost ethereal, as if she, too, were part of the magic unfolding in the sky. "Alara," Michael said softly, breaking the silence between them. She turned to him, her eyes reflecting the dancing colors. "Yes, Michael." He hesitated for a moment, then reached out, his hand gently brushing against hers. This is beautiful, all of this, but you make it more than that." Alara's breath caught, her gaze locking onto his. They sat in silence for a moment, their hands touching, their connection deeper than words. Slowly, Alara leaned closer, her face inches from his. For a moment, time seemed to stop as the universe unfolded above them. Then, Alara whispered, "Michael, not just friend." With those words, she closed the distance, her lips meeting his in a tender, gentle kiss. The world around them seemed to dissolve, leaving only the two of them, bathed in the soft glow of the Festival of Lights. When they pulled apart, Michael's heart was pounding. Alara smiled softly, her fingers lingering against his cheek. For the first time, Michael felt like he had truly found something worth fighting for, something that transcended the planet, the exile, and the danger lurking in the distance. He had found her. Their peaceful moment under the lights didn't last long. The very next day, as they returned to their makeshift shelter, they were ambushed by a group of soldiers. Alien figures clad in dark, angular armor, sent by Alara's brother to hunt her down. Michael had barely a moment to react as the soldiers burst from the dense foliage, weapons raised and voices shouting in a language he couldn't understand. Alara's eyes widened in terror, but before she could move, Michael grabbed her hand and pulled her into a sprint. "Run!" he shouted, his instincts kicking in as they darted into the jungle. The soldiers gave chase, their heavy footsteps pounding behind them. Michael's heart raced as he and Alara weaved through the thick trees, using the terrain to their advantage. But he knew they couldn't outrun their pursuers for long. The soldiers were faster, more prepared, and heavily armed. They needed to find a place to fight back, or they'd be caught. "This way," Alara called, leading Michael toward a narrow ravine hidden by overgrown vegetation. They slipped through the gap, just as the soldiers closed in, using the natural cover to evade detection for a few precious moments. Michael knelt beside Alara, his pulse pounding in his ears. He could hear the soldiers shouting orders, their voices getting closer. His military training was screaming at him to act, but he had limited resources. Just a makeshift knife and a few traps he had set in the surrounding area. But then he saw something in Alara's eyes, a flicker of determination. This was no longer just about survival. Alara wasn't running from her past anymore. She was ready to face it. Alara whispered to him, her words sharp with resolve. "We fight," Michael nodded. They had no choice now. With careful precision, they set up a quick trap using the natural elements around them. Alara's knowledge of the land, combined with Michael's tactical experience, made them a formidable team. They used vines to create snares, rocks to form a makeshift barricade, and hidden pits to slow down their attackers. It wasn't long before the soldiers found them. The fight was intense. Michael fought with everything he had, using the terrain to his advantage. He disabled 2 of the soldiers with precise strikes, using the traps they had set to catch the others off guard. Alara, though less skilled in combat, moved with a grace and determination that left Michael in awe. She fought fiercely, using her knowledge of the jungle to evade and outmaneuver their attackers. But they were outnumbered, and as the fight dragged on, it became clear they couldn't hold out much longer. Just as the situation seemed desperate, one of the soldiers grabbed Alara, dragging her toward a waiting ship hidden in the trees. Michael's heart leaped into his throat as he saw her struggle, her eyes wide with fear. Without hesitation, Michael charged toward the soldier, adrenaline surging through him. He tackled the soldier to the ground, knocking the weapon from his hand. With a swift, decisive motion, Michael incapacitated him and pulled Alara to safety. For a moment, they stood there, breathing hard, the jungle eerily quiet around them. "We have to go," Michael said, his voice urgent. "More will come." Alara nodded, her eyes filled with gratitude and something deeper, something that mirrored what Michael felt for her. They had survived this time, but Michael knew that her brother's forces wouldn't stop until she was captured or killed. Their bond had deepened in ways neither of them had expected, but now they would have to fight for it, for each other and for their future. As they disappeared back into the jungle, Michael's mind was already racing with plans. They couldn't keep running. If they wanted to survive, they would have to take the fight to Alara's brother and reclaim her rightful place. This wasn't just a fight for survival anymore. It was a fight for love. Michael and Alara moved swiftly and silently through the dense jungle, their footsteps barely disturbing the glowing undergrowth. After their near capture, it was clear they could no longer survive by simply hiding. Alara's brother wouldn't stop until he had her in chains or worse. The time had come to take the fight to him. But they couldn't do it alone. They needed help, a rebellion. As they traveled, Alara spoke of the fractured state of her people. Her brother, now the self-proclaimed king, ruled through fear and intimidation, having crushed any opposition when he seized power. Those who once supported Alara's family had either fled or gone into hiding. There were whispers of dissent, pockets of resistance scattered across the planet, but they were unorganized and fearful of what would happen if they stood against the tyrant. "We must unite them," Alara said firmly, her voice filled with quiet determination as they paused in a clearing. "They fear my brother, but they will fight if they have a leader. If they see me, if they know I am alive, they will rise." Michael nodded, understanding the gravity of her words. "You give them hope," he said. "They need someone to believe in, someone to rally around. We can do this, Alara. We just need to be smart about it." Over the next few days, they worked tirelessly, moving from one hidden outpost to another, contacting former allies of Alara's family and those who had turned against her brother's rule. Each encounter was fraught with tension, but one by one, the pieces of their rebellion began to fall into place. The people, long weary of tyranny, were ready for change, and Alara's presence ignited a spark in them that had been dormant for too long. Michael brought his tactical expertise to the table, organizing the fighters into units, training them in guerrilla warfare, and using his knowledge of battle strategy to prepare them for the inevitable conflict. Though outnumbered and outgunned, they had the advantage of terrain and surprise. With Alara's deep understanding of the planet's geography and Michael's skill in combat, they made a formidable team. Alara's leadership inspired loyalty and courage. She wasn't just a figurehead to these people. She fought alongside them, strategized with them, and gave them a reason to believe that victory was possible. Her quiet strength and resilience earned their respect, and soon the rebellion grew from scattered factions into a cohesive force, ready to challenge her brother's regime. But as they built their army, the bond between Michael and Alara grew stronger too. The shared struggle, the danger, and the hope for a better future bound them in ways neither had anticipated. Every moment they spent together, whether planning a strategy or simply sharing a quiet meal by the fire, deepened their connection. Michael had never felt this way before, like he was fighting for more than just survival. He was fighting for her, and for the life they might build together once the battle was over. One night, as they sat alone by a small fire, reviewing maps of the capital, Alara leaned closer to Michael. "You've given me more than I ever thought I could have again," she said softly, her eyes reflecting the firelight. "I thought I had lost everything. But with you, I feel like there's hope. Not just for my people, but for me." Michael's heart raced at her words. He reached out, taking her hand in his. "You're not alone in this, Alara. I'm with you, no matter what happens. We'll fight, and we'll win. Together." Their faces were inches apart, and in that moment, the weight of everything, the rebellion, the war they were about to fight, faded into the background. Alara leaned in, and Michael met her halfway, their lips brushing softly, then deepening into a kiss filled with all the emotions they had kept locked away for so long. When they finally pulled apart, Alara smiled, a rare, genuine smile that Michael had come to treasure. "Together," she whispered, the word filled with promise. They would need that strength in the days to come. The battle for the throne was on the horizon, and they were ready to face it, no matter the cost. The morning of the assault on the capital dawned with a pale, eerie light that barely pierced through the thick jungle canopy. The air was heavy with anticipation as Michael and Alara stood before their assembled forces, a ragtag army of rebels prepared to risk everything for the future of their planet. Michael's heart pounded in his chest as he went over the final plans. The capital was heavily fortified, and Alara's brother had amassed a sizable force to protect his rule. But Michael had planned the attack meticulously. They would strike from multiple angles, using the knowledge of the terrain to their advantage. Their aim wasn't to overpower the enemy, it was to outmaneuver them. Alara stood at his side, her posture regal and determined. She had exchanged her jungle garb for armor, a combination of her family's royal insignia and the practical attire of a warrior. She looked every bit the queen she was destined to be. "The people will follow you," Michael said quietly, glancing at her. "They've been waiting for this." Alara nodded, though he could see the tension in her eyes. "I know, and I won't let them down." The signal to move came just before dawn. The rebel forces split into small units, creeping through the dense jungle toward the city's walls. Michael led one group, while Alara led another. Their strategy was to hit key points in the capital simultaneously, creating chaos and confusion among the enemy ranks. The first attack came swiftly. Explosions rocked the outer defenses, and Michael's group surged forward, taking advantage of the confusion to disable the city's energy shields. The capital's defenders scrambled to respond, but they were caught off guard by the precision and speed of the rebel assault. Michael fought with calculated ferocity, leading his group deeper into the city's heart. The streets, once filled with fear, were now alive with rebellion. Civilians, emboldened by Alara's presence, joined the fight, rising against the oppressive regime that had held them in chains for too long. As Michael fought through the chaos, his thoughts never strayed far from Alara. She was leading the most dangerous assault, the charge on the palace itself. Her brother's forces would be concentrated there, and Michael knew that this would be the final test of their rebellion. Explosions echoed through the streets, and Michael pushed forward, cutting down enemy soldiers with precision. His group reached the palace gates just in time to see Alara's forces engage in fierce combat with her brother's elite guard. The fight was brutal, the stakes higher than ever. In the midst of the battle, Michael spotted Alara. She moved like a warrior queen, her blade flashing as she fought her way toward the palace steps. Her brother, the self-proclaimed king, stood waiting for her, flanked by his most loyal soldiers. Michael's heart pounded as he fought his way to her side, taking down guards with ruthless efficiency. As he reached her, they shared a brief, wordless glance, an understanding that this was the moment everything had been leading to. Together, they charged up the palace steps, their forces behind them. Alara's brother sneered as he saw them approach, his voice dripping with disdain. "Sister," he spat, raising his weapon, "you should have stayed in exile." Alara's face was calm, her voice steady. "Your time is over." The battle that followed was fierce, a clash of wills as much as weapons. Michael fought alongside Alara, their movements synchronized, their connection deeper than words. The fight was brutal, but they were driven by something far stronger than their enemy's hatred. They were fighting for a future. And finally, after what felt like hours, Alara disarmed her brother with a swift, decisive strike. He fell to his knees, breathing heavily, his arrogance shattered. "You've lost," Alara said, her voice ringing with finality. "Your reign of fear ends today." The capital fell silent as the rebels secured the palace. Alara's brother, stripped of his power, was taken away. The people, her people, erupted in cheers, their voices rising in celebration of their new queen. As the sun set over the liberated city, Michael and Alara stood on the palace balcony looking out over the world they had fought so hard to save. "We did it," Michael said softly, turning to her. Alara, her hand slipping into his. "No," she corrected gently, "we did it together." Their victory was not just one of battle, but of love, hope, and the future they would build. Together. The capital was theirs, the tyrant overthrown, and the people hailed Alara as their rightful queen. The battle had been won, but as the dust settled over the once bloody streets, the cost of that victory became clear. Bodies lay strewn across the city, and the cries of the wounded echoed through the palace halls. The rebels had triumphed, but not without sacrifice. Michael stood by the window of the royal chambers, staring out at the city below. His body was bruised and aching, but his mind was elsewhere. Victory should have felt sweeter, but the weight of the loss hung heavy on his heart. Many of the rebels who had fought beside them had not survived. They had given their lives to see Ilara's brother dethroned, and now the burden of rebuilding this fractured world fell on those who remained. Ilara entered the room, her once pristine armor now battered and stained. She moved with the quiet grace of a ruler, but her face showed the weariness of a soldier who had seen too much. Michael turned to face her, his eyes searching hers for some sign of relief, but all he saw was the same conflict that had been gnawing at him since the battle ended. "We won," Michael said softly, though the words felt hollow. Ilara walked to his side, her gaze following his out the window. "Yes, but at what cost?" she whispered, her voice thick with grief. "So many have died, and now I am queen, but I must lead a broken kingdom. My people will look to me for answers, for strength, and I don't know if I have it to give." Michael placed a hand on her shoulder, the warmth of his touch offering her a brief moment of comfort. "You don't have to carry this burden alone, Ilara. You're not the only one who fought for this. We all did. And you have the strength, I've seen it in you every day. But you don't have to be perfect. You just have to lead with the heart that's brought us this far." Ilara turned to face him fully, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Michael, I've lived in exile for so long. I fought to reclaim this throne, but now that I have it, I fear I'm not enough." He reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "You're not just a queen, Ilara. You're a leader. You've shown these people hope, something they've lived without for years. That's more powerful than any crown or title." The room was quiet as they stood there, the weight of their shared experiences hanging between them. Ilara's gaze softened as she looked at Michael, her hand still entwined with his. "You've given me more than I could have ever asked for, Michael. Not just in this fight, but in everything. I don't know what I would have done without you." Michael smiled, though his eyes were serious. "We found each other when we both needed it most. This wasn't just your fight. It was ours." She turned to him, her violet eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and love. "I've lost so much, but I've gained more than I ever thought possible. I love you, Michael." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything they had been through together. Michael's heart swelled as he heard them, and without hesitation, he pulled her into his arms, pressing his forehead to hers. "I love you too, Ilara," he whispered, his voice filled with the same depth of feeling. They kissed, their connection deepening in that moment, not just as allies or lovers, but as two souls who had found each other in the vastness of the universe. Their love had grown in the midst of danger and uncertainty, but now it was a foundation they could build their future on. As they pulled apart, Ilara smiled, the weight of the world lifting from her shoulders. "We've come so far," she said softly, her gaze drifting back to the city below. "But there's still so much to do," Michael nodded. "We'll do it together. Whatever comes next, we face it as one." The night stretched on, filled with the sounds of joy and renewal, but for Michael and Ilara, it was the beginning of something more. They had fought for the freedom of a kingdom, but they had also fought for each other. Now, standing on the balcony of the palace, with the stars shining bright above them, they knew that whatever the future held, they would face it side by side. Together, they had reclaimed a world. Together, they would build a new one.